This is my true story. My wife told me I was taking too long to become successful, and she couldn't wait anymore. Said she needed someone who could give her the life she deserved right now. 2 days later, she left me and moved in with a wealthy real estate investor she'd been seeing, filed for divorce, saying we had different priorities in life. Then exactly 2 weeks after she left me, something happened, which destroyed her ego. Before I tell you what happened, tell us where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear this story. My wife Jessica and I had been married for 8 years after meeting in college and building a life together from nothing. Started out sharing a tiny studio apartment and eating ramen noodles while I worked my way through entry-level positions in the tech industry. She'd been supportive in the beginning when we were both young and broke, said she believed in my potential and didn't mind living modestly while I built my career. Watched me work long hours at a startup company called Tech Core Solutions, coming home exhausted night after night from 60-hour work weeks, trying to prove myself and climb the corporate ladder. But as the years passed and we stayed in that same small 2-bedroom apartment while my salary remained modest, Jessica's patience and support started turning into complaints and resentment. She'd make comments about how her friends from college were living in houses while we were still renting, how their husbands drove nice cars while I drove a 10-year-old sedan, how they took vacations to Europe while we could barely afford weekend trips to the beach. Started comparing me constantly to successful men she'd meet through her job as a marketing coordinator at a high-end salon. Would come home telling me about clients who owned businesses or worked in finance making triple what I earned. The complaints became more direct and cruel over time. She'd tell me our apartment embarrassed her when friends visited, and she had to explain why we lived somewhere so small and outdated. Said my old car was humiliating to be seen in when we went out, that she'd started making excuses not to let me pick her up from work because her colleagues would see what I drove. Complained that our budget vacations to cheap hotels and tourist towns were pathetic compared to what her friends posted on social media from their trips to Italy and the Caribbean. Jessica started treating me like a disappointment instead of a partner, would sigh heavily when I'd come home excited about small wins at work, would roll her eyes when I'd talk about potential opportunities at the company. Made it clear she'd lost faith that I'd ever become the successful man she'd thought she was marrying, that she'd wasted her 20s and early 30s waiting for me to achieve something significant that never materialized. Her friends had married men who were already successful, while she'd gambled on potential that hadn't paid off. The criticism extended to every aspect of our life together. She'd complain that we couldn't afford nice restaurants or designer clothes, that I never surprised her with expensive jewelry or spontaneous romantic gestures that cost money we didn't have. Would make bitter comments about how she'd sacrificed having children because we couldn't afford them on my salary, how her biological clock was ticking while we lived like college students in our 30s. Every conversation became about what we didn't have instead of what we were building together. Started noticing around 6 months before she left that Jessica was dressing nicer for work and coming home later, would be on her phone constantly texting someone and smiling in ways she never smiled at me anymore. She'd started going to networking events and professional mixers through her salon job, said she needed to build connections for career advancement, but I suspected she was really looking for someone more successful than me. Would come home from these events talking about impressive men she'd met who owned real estate companies or investment firms, describing their success in ways that made it clear she wished she was married to them instead. Our sex life had died completely over the past year as Jessica became increasingly disgusted by my lack of financial success. Would reject my attempts at intimacy, saying she wasn't attracted to someone who couldn't provide properly. The emotional distance between us grew until we were basically roommates who happened to be married, sharing space, but no longer sharing a life or future together. I could feel her contempt every time she looked at me, could see her mentally calculating whether staying with me or starting over with someone else would give her a better life. Tried talking to her about the growing problems in our marriage, but she'd just list everything I wasn't giving her, all the ways I was failing to meet her expectations of what a husband should provide. Never acknowledged my long hours or dedication to building something, only focused on the fact that after 8 years I still wasn't making enough money to fund the lifestyle she wanted. 3 weeks ago, Jessica asked me to sit down at our kitchen table one evening after I got home from work, her face cold and determined in a way that made my stomach drop before she even started speaking. She'd clearly been planning this conversation and had her points organized. Started by saying she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage and her future. Told me she was 32 years old and couldn't keep living this way. Couldn't keep waiting and hoping I'd eventually become the successful man she'd thought I had potential to be 8 years earlier. She said directly that she'd given me enough time to prove myself and build a career that could support the lifestyle she deserved, that 8 years was more than fair, and she couldn't sacrifice any more of her life waiting for success that might never come. Explained that her friends were living in beautiful homes and taking luxury vacations and wearing designer clothes while she was stuck in a small apartment with a husband who drove an embarrassing car. Said she'd been patient and supportive, but her patience had run out completely. Jessica delivered her ultimatum with no emotion in her voice. Told me I had 1 month to show her a concrete plan for how I'd dramatically increase my income and our standard of living. Said if I couldn't provide proof of a significant promotion or job change that would at least double my salary, she was done with the marriage. Made it clear she wasn't interested in hearing about potential or future opportunities, only wanted guarantees of immediate financial improvement that would change our circumstances right away. Tried to tell her I was working on something significant at TechCore that could change everything soon, that she needed to trust me just a little longer. But I couldn't give her details because the project was under strict confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure contracts that would cost me my job if I violated them. Jessica laughed bitterly and said that was exactly the problem, that I was always talking about something big coming soon that never actually materialized. Said she'd heard promises about potential opportunities for years and was done believing in my empty assurances. She told me she needed someone who could give her the life she deserved right now in the present, not 5 or 10 years in the future when it might be too late for her to have children or enjoy her youth. Said she was still young and attractive enough to find a man who was already successful instead of gambling on someone who might never achieve anything significant. The cruelty of her words was stunning, talking about our 8-year marriage like it was a failed investment she needed to cut her losses on. 2 days after that conversation, Jessica moved out of our apartment while I was at work, took half our furniture and all her belongings, and left her keys on the kitchen counter. Found a note saying she'd filed for divorce that morning, citing irreconcilable differences, that her lawyer would be contacting me about dividing our minimal assets. The note was cold and businesslike, no emotion or acknowledgement of 8 years together, just instructions about forwarding her mail and canceling joint accounts. Discovered through mutual friends that Jessica had moved directly into the penthouse apartment of Richard Brennan, a 50-year-old divorced real estate developer she'd met at a networking event 3 months earlier. Richard owned luxury properties across the city, drove expensive cars, took monthly international vacations, everything my modest tech salary could never provide. Friends told me Jessica had been seeing Richard secretly for weeks before leaving me, had been planning her exit while still living in our apartment and pretending we had a marriage worth saving. The divorce papers arrived 4 days after she moved out, her lawyer pushing for a quick settlement since we had no children and minimal shared assets. Jessica wanted it finalized fast so she could move on with Richard without the inconvenience of still being legally married to her broke husband. Mutual friends said she'd been bragging about her upgrade, telling everyone who'd listened that she'd finally found a real man who could provide the lifestyle she deserved after wasting her 20s married to someone going nowhere. Sat in our half-empty apartment staring at divorce papers and feeling like my 8-year marriage had been reduced to a financial transaction that hadn't met her return on investment expectations. That the woman I'd loved had never actually loved me, but only the success she'd hoped I'd achieve. What Jessica didn't know when she delivered her ultimatum and walked out of our marriage was that the week before she'd left me, I'd been in final confidential negotiations for the biggest promotion of my entire career. TechCore Solutions, where I'd worked for 6 years, had been acquired by Maxwell Industries, a Fortune 500 technology corporation worth billions, and they were restructuring our entire company as a new division under their corporate umbrella. The acquisition had been kept absolutely secret for months during negotiations, all employees bound by strict non-disclosure agreements that threatened immediate termination and legal action if anyone leaked information. The acquiring company had identified me specifically as essential talent they wanted to retain and promote, had been interviewing me privately for weeks about taking over as CEO of the newly formed division they were creating. Maxwell's executives had reviewed my work leading product development at TechCore, were impressed by innovations I'd spearheaded that had made our small startup attractive for acquisition. They'd told me directly I was their first choice to run the new division, that they saw leadership potential that justified putting me in charge of a multi-million-dollar operation. The final offer had come through exactly 5 days before Jessica moved out, sitting in a conference room with Maxwell executives discussing compensation and responsibilities that would change my life completely. They were offering an annual salary of $850,000 plus performance bonuses that could add another $200,000, stock options in Maxwell Industries worth potentially millions if the company continued growing. Executive benefits package included company car, expense account, executive health care, retirement contributions that exceeded my current entire salary. Couldn't tell Jessica any of this because the acquisition announcement was still weeks away, and my NDA was ironclad. Violating it would cost me the promotion and potentially result in lawsuits from both companies. Had been planning to surprise her with the news once it became public, imagined her face when I'd tell her we could afford everything she'd been complaining about for years. Was going to take her to an expensive restaurant and tell her over champagne that all her patience and sacrifice had finally paid off, that we were about to become exactly the successful couple she'd wanted us to be. The timeline for the public announcement had been set for 3 weeks after Jessica's ultimatum, the acquiring company planning a major press campaign to introduce their new division and leadership team. I'd signed all the paperwork and accepted the position 48 hours before Jessica told me she was leaving, had literally become the CEO she'd always wanted me to be while she was planning her exit to Richard's penthouse. Was sitting on the biggest achievement of my life, unable to share it with my wife because of legal contracts I couldn't break. Spent the week after Jessica left trying to decide if I should violate my NDA and tell her about the promotion to stop the divorce. Considered risking my career to save my marriage, but realized she'd left me not because I wasn't successful, but because I wasn't successful fast enough for her timeline. Had chosen a man who was already wealthy over waiting 2 more weeks to discover I'd achieved everything she'd demanded. The timing revealed what she really valued, proved she'd rather have immediate money with a stranger than build success with her husband. The promotion would become public exactly 14 days after Jessica moved in with Richard, would make headlines in business publications and advertisements across the city announcing Maxwell's new division and CEO. My face would appear on billboards and in magazines. My name would be in press releases describing the acquisition and leadership team. Within 2 weeks, Jessica would discover she'd left her husband 72 hours before he became a millionaire CEO, would realize her impatience had cost her everything she'd claimed to want. Decided not to tell her about the promotion before it became public. Let her enjoy her 2 weeks living in Richard's penthouse, thinking she'd made a smart decision to upgrade from her broke husband. Let her brag to friends about finding a real man who could provide for her properly. Then the announcement would come, and she'd understand exactly what she'd walked away from by leaving 2 weeks too early. Would realize her calculated betrayal had been perfectly timed to destroy her own life. Exactly 2 weeks after Jessica moved out, Maxwell Industries launched their massive publicity campaign announcing the acquisition of TechCore Solutions and the formation of their new technology division. The marketing team had planned an aggressive rollout across multiple channels, billboards throughout the city, full-page advertisements in major business publications, digital campaigns on LinkedIn, and tech news websites. They'd decided to personalize the campaign by featuring me prominently as the face of the new division, positioning me as a young, innovative leader driving the company's future growth. The billboards went up overnight on major highways and busy downtown streets. Massive 40-foot displays featuring my professional headshot alongside the headline, "Meet James Richardson, CEO of TechCore Solutions, leading innovation, driving tomorrow." My face was suddenly everywhere across the city looking professional and successful in a way that contradicted everything Jessica had said about me being a failure. The marketing team had made me look powerful and accomplished, the image of someone who'd achieved significant success rather than someone stuck in a going-nowhere career. Business magazines hit newsstands that same morning with feature articles about the acquisition. Maxwell's CEO quoted talking about how they'd specifically wanted to retain and promote key talent like me, who understood both the technology and the vision. The articles detailed my new compensation package without exact numbers, but making clear I was now in the executive class, earning well into six figures with significant stock options. Trade publications in the tech industry ran stories about my promotion, highlighting my previous work and innovations that had made me valuable enough to lead an entire division. My LinkedIn profile exploded with activity as the news spread through professional networks, former colleagues and industry contacts congratulating me on the promotion and sharing the announcement. The post from Maxwell Industries announcing my appointment got thousands of likes and hundreds of comments within hours, my face and title appearing in feeds across the business world. Suddenly, everyone who'd known me as a mid-level employee at a small startup was seeing me presented as a rising corporate executive leading a multi-million-dollar division. The publicity was deliberately designed to be impossible to miss for anyone in our city. Maxwell wanted to make a statement about their acquisition and their faith in young leadership. My face appeared on billboards along the highway Jessica would take to get to Richard's penthouse from her salon job, on digital displays in the downtown shopping district where she'd go for lunch, in the business section of newspapers delivered to upscale buildings where Richard's properties were located. The campaign saturated our metropolitan area for maximum visibility and impact. Former coworkers started texting me photos of the billboards they'd seen, sent congratulations and jokes about me being famous now with my face all over the city. My parents called crying with pride seeing their son's success publicly celebrated in such a visible way, said they'd driven around taking pictures of every billboard they could find. Friends from college reached out saying they'd seen the news and couldn't believe the guy they'd known eating ramen in a dorm room was now a CEO with his face on 40-foot advertisements. The transformation from modest startup employee to publicly celebrated executive happened literally overnight. Went from being someone Jessica had called embarrassing and unsuccessful to someone whose achievements were advertised across an entire city. The timing was devastatingly perfect, happening exactly 2 weeks after she'd left me for someone she thought was more successful. Exactly when she'd be settling into her new life with Richard, thinking she'd made a smart upgrade from her failure husband. The billboards would stay up for 6 weeks as part of Maxwell's marketing campaign, meaning my face would be unavoidable throughout the city for over a month, reminding Jessica daily of what she'd walked away from. Every time she drove anywhere or walked downtown or opened a business magazine, she'd see evidence of the success she'd claimed I'd never achieve. Would be confronted with proof that she'd left me days before everything changed. The publicity campaign that was meant to announce Maxwell's acquisition would also become the perfect vehicle for Jessica to discover her catastrophic timing in abandoning her marriage. My former colleague Marcus from TechCore, who'd stayed friends with some of Jessica's coworkers, texted me 3 hours after the billboards went up, said he had something I needed to see and attached a photo. The image showed Jessica standing frozen on a downtown sidewalk, staring up at one of the massive billboards featuring my face and CEO title, her mouth literally hanging open in shock. Richard stood next to her looking equally stunned. Both of them stopped mid-stride on the busy street with shopping bags in their hands from expensive stores. Marcus explained in his text that his girlfriend worked at the salon with Jessica and had been walking nearby when she'd witnessed the moment. Said Jessica had been talking and laughing with Richard 1 second and then went completely silent the next when she'd looked up and seen my face 40 feet tall. His girlfriend had quickly snapped the photo before Jessica noticed anyone watching, captured the exact moment when Jessica realized what she'd walked away from. The timestamp on the photo showed it was taken around 2 in the afternoon on the day the billboards launched. Could see in the photo that Jessica had been shopping for furniture based on the bags from high-end home stores, probably buying expensive pieces to decorate Richard's penthouse and make it feel like her new home. She'd clearly been enjoying her upgraded life, spending Richard's money on luxury items, having the shopping experience she'd always complained we couldn't afford on my salary. Then she'd looked up and seen evidence that her husband she'd left 2 weeks earlier was now earning more than enough to fund every shopping trip she'd ever dreamed of. Marcus's girlfriend reported through Marcus that she'd watched Jessica stand there staring at the billboard for almost 5 minutes while Richard tried to get her attention and ask what was wrong. Jessica had apparently started crying right there on the sidewalk, pulled out her phone, and started frantically searching for news about me. found all the press releases and business articles confirming that yes, her soon-to-be ex-husband was now CEO of a major corporate division. Richard had looked increasingly uncomfortable as Jessica became more upset, clearly realizing this wasn't the reaction of someone happily moving on with her new relationship. Other mutual friends started sending me similar reports throughout that day and the following week, people who'd spotted Jessica around the city and watched her reaction to seeing my billboards. Someone saw her pulled over on the side of the highway staring up at one of the massive displays, sitting in her car for 20 minutes, just looking at my face and the CEO title. Another friend reported seeing her in a coffee shop with her laptop open, searching my name obsessively, reading every article about my promotion with tears running down her face. The timing of her discovery couldn't have been worse for Jessica's narrative about upgrading to a better life. She'd spent 2 weeks bragging to friends and coworkers about leaving her unsuccessful husband for Richard, who could actually provide for her. Had been posting carefully curated photos on social media of Richard's penthouse and expensive dinners, making sure everyone saw she'd traded up from her modest life with me. Then my face appeared everywhere across the city with news that her broke husband she'd abandoned was now a millionaire CEO. Friends told me Jessica's social media posts stopped abruptly the day the billboards went up. No more bragging photos or updates about her fabulous new life with Richard. Her friends started commenting on her previous posts with links to articles about my promotion, making observations about her timing in leaving me, pointing out that she'd walked away from exactly what she'd claimed she wanted. The comments ranged from sympathetic to mocking, but all of them acknowledged that Jessica had made a catastrophic miscalculation about when to abandon her marriage. The photo Marcus sent me of Jessica's face staring up at that billboard became the image I thought about whenever I wondered if leaving the divorce alone had been the right decision. Proof that she hadn't left because she didn't love me, but because she couldn't wait 2 more weeks for success to arrive. Her expression in that photo showed pure devastation and regret. The realization that her impatience had cost her everything she'd spent 8 years supposedly working toward with me. My phone started ringing within an hour of Jessica seeing that first billboard, her number appearing on my screen over and over while I was in meetings at Maxwell's headquarters discussing my transition into the CEO role. Let the first 3 calls go to voicemail because I was in important discussions about division strategy and didn't want to deal with her reaction. By the time I checked my phone during a break, she'd called 17 times in just 2 hours, left multiple voicemails that I could see were getting progressively longer and more desperate based on the duration timestamps. Listened to the voicemails in my car after leaving the office, heard Jessica's voice evolving from shock to desperation to barely controlled panic across the messages. The first one was her asking breathlessly if the billboard she'd just seen was really me, if I was actually the CEO being advertised across the city, saying she couldn't believe what she was looking at. Her voice sounded genuinely stunned, like she'd thought the billboard was some kind of mistake or joke, couldn't process that her unsuccessful husband had achieved major success within 2 weeks of her leaving. The second and third voicemails showed her panic increasing as she'd apparently found the press releases and articles confirming my promotion was real, begging me to please call her back immediately because we needed to talk urgently. Said she'd just found out about my position and wanted to understand how this had happened, when I'd known about the promotion, why I hadn't told her before she'd made her decision to leave. Her tone suggested she already knew the answer but was hoping somehow the timing had been different than what was obvious. By the 5th voicemail, her desperation was obvious and pathetic, saying things like she'd made a terrible mistake and moved too quickly, that if she'd known about my promotion, she never would have left. Claimed she'd been patient for 8 years and just happened to give up right before everything came together, that the timing was just bad luck rather than revealing anything about her character or priorities. Asked if we could meet in person to discuss what this meant for our relationship and whether the divorce could be stopped. The later voicemails became increasingly frantic as I continued not responding. Jessica clearly spiraling as she processed what she'd done and calculated what she'd lost. One message had her crying and saying she'd always believed in me and never stopped loving me, that leaving had been about her fears and insecurities rather than anything I'd done wrong. The lies were stunning in their audacity, given that she'd literally told me 2 weeks earlier I was a failure who couldn't provide the life she deserved, had moved in with another man while bragging about her upgrade. She left a message around midnight that night after apparently spending hours obsessing about the situation, voice hoarse from crying as she explained that she understood now why I hadn't told her about the promotion. Said she realized I'd been bound by confidentiality agreements and couldn't share the information, that if she'd just trusted me for 2 more weeks, everything would have been different. Begged me to understand she'd been impatient and scared rather than malicious. Asked if there was any chance we could work things out now that my success had finally arrived. The voicemails continued over the next 3 days, Jessica calling every few hours, leaving increasingly desperate messages, asking why I wouldn't respond to her. Started saying things about how we'd built this success together over 8 years, that she deserved to share in the rewards of what we'd worked toward as a team. The entitlement was breathtaking given that she'd abandoned me specifically because she didn't want to wait for success, had chosen immediate wealth with a stranger over building anything with her husband. Blocked her number after listening to a particularly manipulative voicemail where she claimed she'd been planning to come back to me anyway because she'd realized Richard wasn't right for her, that seeing my billboard had just confirmed what she'd already been feeling. The transparent lie made me angry enough to cut off her access completely, refused to let her rewrite history to make herself look like anything other than someone who'd calculated wrong and wanted a do-over now that she'd seen the cost of her choice. My divorce attorney, who I'd hired to handle Jessica's rushed settlement, had recommended I also hire a private investigator to document her new living situation with Richard. Said it might be relevant for the divorce proceedings if she was cohabiting with someone wealthy while claiming financial need. The investigator I hired was a former police detective named Sarah Morrison who specialized in domestic cases, gave her Richard's address and asked her to document Jessica's activities and relationship status for the court records. Sarah called me 4 days after the billboard went up with an update that I hadn't expected. Said she'd been watching Richard's penthouse building and had witnessed him literally throwing Jessica's belongings out onto the sidewalk while she stood there crying and begging him not to do this. Security footage from the building that Sarah had obtained through contacts showed Richard had kicked Jessica out completely, told her to leave his property immediately and not come back. She'd gone from living in a luxury penthouse to being homeless in less than a week after my promotion became public. Sarah explained what had happened based on interviews with Richard's doorman and building staff who'd witnessed the breakup, said Richard had been attracted to Jessica specifically because she'd seemed different from the gold diggers he usually encountered in his wealthy social circles. He'd told friends she was low maintenance and not materialistic because she'd been married to a struggling tech worker, thought he'd found a genuine woman who valued him for himself rather than his money. Jessica had apparently played into this narrative, telling Richard she'd left her marriage because of emotional incompatibility rather than financial disappointment. But Richard's perception of Jessica changed completely the moment he saw her reaction to my billboard, watched her become frantic and desperate, seeing that her ex-husband was now a CEO earning significant money. The doorman reported hearing a massive argument in Richard's penthouse the evening after Jessica saw the billboard, heard her crying and Richard yelling about lies and deception. Building staff said Richard had apparently gone through Jessica's phone while she was sleeping and found all her desperate voicemails to me begging to reconcile. Saw messages where she'd admitted leaving me for financial reasons. Richard had confronted Jessica the next morning with evidence of her 17 calls and voicemails to me, accused her of being exactly the kind of gold digger he'd thought she wasn't. Told her he'd believed she genuinely cared about him, but now saw she'd just been using him as a financial upgrade until something better came along. The fact that she'd immediately tried to reconnect with me the moment my success became public proved she'd never valued Richard for himself, had just been settling for him until her first choice became wealthy enough to reconsider. Sarah's investigation revealed Richard had a history of being burned by women who wanted his money rather than him, had been married twice before to women who'd divorced him for larger settlements, was paranoid about being used for his wealth. Jessica's reaction to my success had triggered all his fears and suspicions, made him question every conversation they'd had and every reason she'd given for leaving her marriage. He'd told her directly she was a liar and a user who'd destroyed her marriage chasing money and would do the same to any man she was with. The investigator provided me with photos of Jessica standing on the sidewalk outside Richard's building, surrounded by her hastily packed belongings, crying while trying to call someone on her phone. Sarah had followed her from there to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, watched her check in looking devastated and defeated. Later investigation showed Jessica had moved from the motel back to her parents' house in the suburbs, gone from a luxury penthouse to her childhood bedroom in less than a week. Friends reported that Richard had told everyone in his social circle about what happened, warned other wealthy men about Jessica specifically, and about women who leave marriages the moment someone richer appears. Her reputation in Richard's world was completely destroyed. She'd become a cautionary tale about gold diggers who miscalculate and get caught. The relationship she'd thought was her upgrade had lasted less than 3 weeks before imploding, because she couldn't hide her true priorities when faced with my success. Jessica's friends, who'd congratulated her enthusiastically when she'd left me for Richard, turned on her viciously once my billboard went up and the timing of her mistake became public knowledge. The same women who'd been liking her posts about Richard's penthouse and expensive dinners were now posting screenshots of my CEO announcement with commentary mocking her spectacularly bad judgment. One of her closest friends from college posted a side-by-side comparison of Jessica's divorce announcement and my promotion announcement showing they'd happened 2 weeks apart, captioned, "Imagine leaving your husband 2 weeks before he becomes a millionaire CEO." The post went viral within our social circle and then spread beyond, getting shared hundreds of times across different networks as people found the timing too perfect and too devastating to not comment on. Friends of friends who'd never met Jessica were weighing in with opinions about her choices. Strangers were using her story as an example of impatience and greed backfiring catastrophically. The comments ranged from sympathetic observations about tragic timing to brutal mockery about gold diggers getting what they deserved when they calculated wrong. Jessica had deleted most of her social media accounts within 3 days of the billboard going up, but people had already screenshot her previous posts, bragging about Richard and her new upgraded life. These screenshots circulated with timestamps showing she'd been actively celebrating her decision to leave me during the exact 2 weeks before my promotion became public. Posts where she'd written things like, "Finally with a real man who knows how to provide," and "No more settling for potential over reality," were being shared with commentary about how those words had aged poorly in just 14 days. Her former friends weren't just sharing posts, but were having entire public conversations analyzing what Jessica's choices revealed about her character and values, dissecting whether the timing made her behavior worse or if she would have done the same thing even if my promotion had come earlier. Some people argued she'd been unlucky with timing, while others said the timing just exposed who she'd always been, someone who'd married me for what she'd hoped I'd become rather than who I actually was. The most brutal commentary came from women in our social circle who'd been married for years and felt Jessica had betrayed some kind of sisterhood by abandoning her marriage for money. They posted long essays about the importance of supporting partners through career development, about how building wealth together created stronger relationships than jumping to whoever currently had the most money. Used Jessica's situation as a cautionary tale for other women about the dangers of impatience and materialism, turned her into a symbol of everything wrong with valuing financial success over genuine partnership. Jessica's work colleagues at the salon apparently made her life miserable with constant comments and questions about the situation. Customers who'd seen my billboard would come in asking if she was the ex-wife who'd left me right before my promotion. The salon owner eventually asked Jessica to take time off because her presence was creating drama and distraction. Clients were more interested in gossiping about her failed marriage than getting their hair done. She'd become too much of a spectacle to function normally in her workplace. Even people who'd never particularly liked me felt sorry for me and angry at Jessica, saw my story as a man who'd worked hard and stayed loyal while his wife abandoned him at the worst possible moment. The narrative became about my perseverance and her betrayal rather than about our failed marriage. I was cast as the sympathetic victim while she became the villain of her own story. The public humiliation was worse than anything I could have planned or orchestrated. Her own choices and timing had created perfect conditions for social destruction. The woman who'd left me because I was embarrassing had become the most embarrassed person in our entire social circle, known by hundreds of people as the wife who'd left her husband 2 weeks before he became a CEO. Her name became synonymous with poor timing and bad judgment. People would reference pulling a Jessica when talking about giving up right before success arrived. She'd wanted to escape being associated with my lack of success, but instead became permanently associated with failing to recognize success that was 2 weeks away. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and 3 weeks after I'd blocked Jessica's number, my executive assistant Jennifer buzzed my intercom one afternoon saying my ex-wife was in the lobby, demanding to see me. Jennifer sounded apologetic and stressed, said she'd explained I wasn't taking personal visitors, but Jessica had refused to leave and was causing a scene, insisting she needed to speak with me urgently. Security was prepared to escort her out if I wanted, but Jennifer thought I should know about the situation before they removed her forcibly from the building. Told Jennifer to send Jessica up to my corner office. Decided I wanted this final confrontation to happen in a space that represented everything she'd walked away from by leaving 2 weeks too early. Wanted her to see the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the expensive furniture, the view of the very billboards featuring my face that had revealed her mistake. Let her walk through Maxwell Industries' executive floor past other high-level offices and conference rooms. Let her understand the world she'd chosen not to be part of by abandoning our marriage. Jessica walked into my office wearing an expensive designer dress and carrying a luxury handbag, clearly clothing she'd bought during her brief time with Richard, trying to look like she belonged in wealthy circles. But her face showed the strain of the past 6 weeks. Makeup not quite covering the evidence of crying and stress, her eyes red and tired. She'd clearly spent significant effort trying to look put together and successful for this meeting, wanting to present herself as someone worthy of reconsideration rather than someone desperate and broken. She started talking immediately before I could say anything, apologized profusely for how everything had happened, and insisted she'd made a terrible mistake leaving when she did. Said she'd been impatient and scared about her future, worried that at 32 she was running out of time to have the life she'd always imagined. Claimed she'd panicked when it seemed like my career wasn't progressing fast enough, made an emotional decision without thinking clearly about what she was giving up. The apology sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced it multiple times trying to find the right words. Jessica explained she understood now why I hadn't told her about the promotion. Acknowledged I'd been bound by legal confidentiality that prevented me from sharing information even with my wife. Said if she'd just been patient for 2 more weeks or trusted me when I'd told her something significant was coming, none of this would have happened. Tried to frame her abandonment as a timing issue rather than a character issue, suggested we'd both been victims of unfortunate circumstances beyond our control. Then she asked directly if there was any possibility we could work things out and reconcile. Said we'd built something together over 8 years that deserved another chance. Claimed she still loved me and always had, that her relationship with Richard had been a mistake, born from desperation rather than genuine feelings. Suggested we could start over now that my financial situation had improved, rebuild our marriage with the resources we'd both wished we'd had before. Looked at her calmly and let her finish her entire rehearsed speech before responding. Watched her fidget nervously as silence stretched between us. Told her I understood exactly what had happened, and there was no confusion about timing or circumstances. Said she'd left me because she needed someone successful immediately and couldn't wait any longer for me to achieve what she'd demanded. She'd found Richard, who could provide the lifestyle she wanted right away, moved in with him within days, and bragged about upgrading from her failure husband. Explained that seeing my billboard hadn't changed her feelings about me or made her realize she'd loved me all along. It had only made her realize she'd calculated wrong about my potential. Said she wasn't asking for reconciliation because she missed me or valued our partnership. She was asking because she'd discovered I was now worth the same amount of money as the man she'd left me for. Told her that wasn't love or regret about losing a relationship. It was disappointment about making a bad investment decision. Jessica started crying and insisting that wasn't true, that she genuinely realized she'd made a mistake about what mattered in life. But her tears didn't move me because I'd heard her voicemails, knew she'd immediately tried to reconnect the moment my wealth became public knowledge. Jessica left my office that day, crying and defeated. Walked past my assistant and the other executives working on my floor, seeing exactly what she'd given up by leaving 2 weeks before my promotion was announced. Never contacted me again after that meeting, apparently finally understood there was no path back to the life she could have had if she'd just waited 14 more days before abandoning our marriage. The divorce was finalized, the papers signed, her decision permanent and irreversible, no matter how much she regretted the timing. My private investigator continued monitoring Jessica's situation for a few more months at my request, wanted to know what happened to someone who'd made such a catastrophic miscalculation about when to give up on their marriage. Sarah reported that Jessica had moved back in with her parents in the suburbs after Richard kicked her out, was living in her childhood bedroom at 32 years old after leaving a marriage, specifically because she'd wanted a more mature and sophisticated life. Her parents apparently weren't sympathetic to her situation, had liked me, and thought Jessica had made a terrible mistake leaving a hard-working husband for someone she barely knew. Jessica had lost her job at the high-end salon after taking too much time off and creating too much workplace drama with her personal situation, was now working retail at a department store, making barely above minimum wage. The investigator found her working behind a cosmetics counter selling makeup to customers, a massive downgrade from the marketing coordinator position she'd held at the upscale salon. Her co-workers apparently knew her story because one of them was friends with someone from her old workplace, meant Jessica couldn't escape her reputation even in a new job. Sarah's final report included photos of Jessica driving the same old car she'd complained about when it had been ours, the vehicle she'd called humiliating and embarrassing when I'd been driving it. She'd apparently sold or returned everything expensive she'd acquired during her brief time with Richard. Couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle she'd briefly enjoyed while living in his penthouse. Was back to living the modest life she'd left me to escape, except now she was doing it alone without a partner or the potential for future improvement. Richard had moved on quickly and married someone else within 4 months of kicking Jessica out, a woman he'd apparently been dating before who'd been willing to give him another chance. Wedding announcements showed Richard marrying a successful attorney who had her own money and career, someone who clearly wasn't with him for financial reasons. Jessica had to see those announcements, knowing she'd lost both relationships through her own choices and timing, had ended up with neither the wealthy man nor the husband who'd become wealthy. Started dating someone new about 8 months after Jessica had left me, a woman named Amanda who worked in marketing at one of Maxwell's partner companies. We'd met at an industry conference where she'd approached me to talk about potential collaboration between our companies, had no idea about my salary or position when she'd first started the conversation. Amanda had actually seemed slightly intimidated when she'd found out I was a CEO, worried the power imbalance might make a relationship complicated, the exact opposite of Jessica's attraction to wealth and status. Jessica's former friends continued posting occasional updates about my life and success on social media, seemed to take pleasure in showing her what she'd missed by leaving when she did. They'd share articles about Maxwell Industries' growth or photos from industry events I attended, always with some comment about timing or decisions. Jessica had apparently kept one anonymous social media account where she could still see these posts, torturing herself by following updates about the life she could have been living. I'm 35 years old now, successful CEO earning more money than Jessica ever dreamed about during our marriage, in a healthy relationship with someone who values me for myself rather than my bank account. Jessica is 34, working retail and living with her parents, known throughout our social circle as the woman who left her husband 2 weeks before he became a millionaire. She destroyed her own life through impatience and greed, gave up right before everything she'd claimed to want finally arrived, and now lives with the consequences of her catastrophic timing every single day.